Okay, guys, welcome. Sorry, some people were having technical difficulties. In other words, Troy Jackson, but didn't want to call him out like that. But anyways, I'm gonna go ahead and turn this over, and I hope you guys enjoy tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Quint Deloach, co-chair of YP.
Hey everybody, I'm Brantley Pittman, the other co-chair for YP for 2021. Thank you for joining us tonight. And we are going to turn things over now to Katie Bishop, who will be the moderator tonight. She is the co-founder of Y'all PR and this year's vice chair of programming. Katie?
Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining us again. I'm super excited to host tonight's Cocktails and Company. And we have focused tonight's Cocktail and Company on all things kind of media. And we're super lucky to have Ryan Heath with us here tonight, who's going to talk to us a little bit about his career path, and then also some insight into where media is and where it's going, and answer all of our questions. So thanks for joining us, Ryan. And I just briefly wanted to go through Ryan's bio so you know a little bit more about him for those who do not. I'm going to read from his bio, so excuse me as I look down. He is the author of Global Translations, which is Politico's global newsletter and podcast. He previously authored Politico's UN Playbook, Brussels Playbook, and the Davos Playbook. Ryan moderated the first presidential debate of the 2019 EU election as a part of a 5-year stint in the Politico's European leadership team. He appears on CNN, NBC, and BBC, and is the author of 2 books on politics. Prior to Politico, Ryan wrote for Sydney Morning Herald in Australia and worked for the European Commission in Brussels as the presidential speechwriter, and later as the Commission's spokesperson for digital issues. On top of that, full transparency, he is my brother-in-law, whom I love very much, and I'm so happy that he's here talking with us. And I did confirm before tonight's Cocktails and Company that he does have a check mark on his Twitter account, but I'm also curious how much he paid for that. So I want to know, how much did you pay Twitter for that check mark?
I did not pay anything, Katie Bishop, and hello everybody. But the problem is, if I ever want to leave Politico or change my Twitter handle, I'm going to lose the check mark. So I'm like in a golden cage now with Politico, trapped around this check mark.
I love it.
And I'm also Australian, if you didn't catch from the accent.
Yes. And he's currently in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, working, but they live full-time in New York. Before pandemic was working heavily in DC, but now in New York.
Yeah, look at that. Red state, blue state, and now I'm talking to a purple state. So it's a good mix.
It's a good mix. So how tonight's going to work is I've put together a couple questions for Ryan, and then at the end, we'll leave it open for Q&A for the all the attendees to answer or ask some questions and get some answers from Ryan. So we will dive right in. And I think the first thing really to get us started is really just to kind of tell us your background, like educational background, and really how you got started in the industry.
Well, I grew up in a pretty regular family in Australia in a small surfing village. So if you know the map of Australia, it's on the east side. It's kind of near Sydney, but it's like near Sydney the way Atlanta is near New Orleans or something like that. Like it's a pretty big country. And I actually feel pretty undereducated compared to a lot of you and a lot of people in America. I did a standard 3-year degree at university in Sydney, but Australia is really just so far away from the rest of the world. I just decided I needed to get out of the place. So I think while I studied journalism, it wasn't really that relevant to what I ended up doing. I got really involved in politics at university. So that actually steered me away from a lot of journalism. I was afraid that I was too opinionated, that I had too many interests in things. So like I was campaigning to get rid of the Queen. We still have the Queen of England as our head of state in Australia. I wanted us to be a republic. I was like rampaging around trying to get rid of library fines, like you name it, I was involved in it. And so I thought I couldn't really be a journalist. I need to go off and serve in some other way. But that said, I did try and write as much as I could. So like Katie was saying, I wrote for the equivalent of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but with opinion articles. And eventually I made my way to England. And, you know, I'm just someone who's roved around a lot of different places. I've got a lot of different interests. I never had a single career plan. Like if you had told me, where will you be in 5 years or 10 years? Like I never really would have been able to tell you the answer. You know, I worked very hard, but I was willing to sort of respond to different events rather than just have this narrow focus on what I was going to do in my career.
So I think a lot of us that are on this call are probably, you know, all of us really are in our, you know, mid to late 20s and 30s. And so all of us are in this position in our careers where we're really in this growth stage. We're still learning so much and we're, you know, every year is a stepping stone to get further where we want. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that you've had along the way, how you've kind of overcome them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think probably if I'm really honest, one of the mistakes I made when I was younger was that I was so determined to succeed. Like I just had to be the youngest person or the first person to do everything that I was doing, you know, like even if these were small achievements. I'm not saying I was running the world or anything like that. And I was just in a rush to get everywhere. And I think by the time I was about 23 or 24, I realized that just is really tiring. And I wasn't sort of able to maintain the friendships that I wanted. Like I was single. Like I just literally never had a proper relationship until I was 29. I was that caught up in myself and achieving things. And I think that, you know, like in hindsight, I can see that you can take things more slowly. Like as long as you're thoughtful and long as you work hard, you don't have to do everything at once. And the other example that I give, it's a bit of a strange one. I'm not saying that anyone else will be in the same situation, but I was really an attention seeker. And I was just like one of those bratty people that the spotlight had to be on me. And I think you all know someone like that, and you probably don't want to be that person. And, you know, when I was 26, I wrote a book, and I went along with a plan from the publishers to put a curse word in the title. And, you know, not many people can say that's happened to them. And I won't even say the name of it. Because I just became really mega ashamed of it really quickly, that I was like so in love with the attention that I would agree to this stupid plan. And then I would keep it off my CV for years. But then actually, in the end, it's the thing that got me the 2 jobs I love most, because the fact that someone would write this controversial book and allow this swear word in the title, it kind of, I think it signaled to other people who want to take risks that I was kind of like them. And so whereas I went through this period of being ashamed of, you know, what my true personality was, like in the end, you know, I relented a bit and, you know, would admit what I did and that it was a true reflection of at least a part of me. And I got the job I love now at Politico, and I got the speechwriter job because of it. And you never would have thought that, looking at it on paper, that these people who run a boring bureaucracy in Brussels would choose the guy who wrote a book with a curse word in the title. Like I never would have predicted that. And sometimes you just have to let things happen to you in that way.
As you were moving throughout your career and moving up throughout your career, I'm just curious, like how often and how much people were looking at that paper record of you? Like what did it look like when you're moving up in the ranks?
Yeah, I think that it is absolutely true that you have to, you know, you have to be conscious of the image you present online or what you're going to be able to put onto your LinkedIn profile. But I didn't feel obliged to follow a particular path. You know, I was willing to change jobs every year in my 20s. And the way I kind of sort of rationalized it or put limits on that impression that I was creating, that I couldn't stick to something, was, you know, I would stay in the same organization, but go to a new role in that organization each year. And the way I've sort of tried to do it in, you know, like partially planned, partially it sort of happened this way, is stick in the same zone for maybe about 7 years at a time. Now, the zone could be one job profile, it could be one company, it could be one government if you happen to work for the government or something like that. You know, so feel free to move around, but just don't constantly be chopping and changing what you're doing. And don't worry if you can't figure out exactly what you love, you know, straight out of college. I don't think you have to do that. Like I really would say that journalism is what I was meant to do. And I only properly got into a full-time journalism role when I was 34. And maybe some people don't have that flexibility. You know, you have to make ends meet, or you've got kids. You can't just jump around like I did. But you shouldn't feel like you have to be stuck in one thing. I think like there's enough options in our world now that there's ways for you to pivot if that's something that you really want to do.
Do you remember that like one aha moment that was either a huge change in literally your career, like if it was something that specifically happened that launched you, or maybe a thought process that just switched for you that launched you into kind of where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, maybe there is like a breakout moment, but it's not the aha moment. So maybe I'll do it in chronological order. So I kind of, where I really sort of hit my stride, I think I was about 28. Like I got the job when I was 27 and I hit the stride when I was 28. And the best advice I can give to you about that is that it came through just being very honest with my boss. And honesty can lead to short-term problems because you become the person that points out uncomfortable truths. You know, some people don't want to hear it. Like they don't like people who rock the boat. But what happened with me was that I got picked for this job because they wanted someone who wasn't like an ordinary civil servant, public servant. They wanted someone who was different. So this woman picked me to move to Brussels in Belgium to be her speechwriter. And her job was, she was in charge of running all the legal suits and cases against people who were ripping off consumers. And it was a really powerful job. And I just literally didn't get it. Like I just took it for the money. I didn't really understand what I was getting myself into. And I realized it was this total political snake pit where everyone was out for themselves and what their next promotion was going to be. And I only ever turned up because I thought it was a fun thing to do for a year or two. I'd go traveling on the weekends around Europe. Wouldn't this be a great thing? And so I just decided I was out of my depth, and the way I would deal with it was by being really honest with her and tell her exactly what I thought about whatever proposal or idea was going on. And she figured out kind of by accident that I was the only one who wasn't in it for himself. And so I ended up getting ahead by not putting myself first. You know, because I put her first, I became the one that she trusted. And we would, you know, I would be the one who would go on trips with her in the end all around Europe. Like we came up with a plan in a plane to Egypt, just the two of us, to get rid of all the cell phone roaming charges in Europe. And we came up with a 12-month plan about how we were going to do it. And we made it happen about 15 months later. And I was just super proud of that because that actually is changing how people get to enjoy their vacation or their work trips. You know, it's not this stressful experience now if you live in Europe. And it came about from the weirdest way, about me just being like 100% honest with this woman about what I thought about her ideas. And it never would have happened if I was looking for myself and just trying to get that next step ahead and please everyone around me. And then the breakout moment, and sorry, this is such a long answer, it was when I started to work for Politico, and it was a startup. So no one had really operated in this trying to make the European Union sexy. I mean, most people just don't even understand what it is. They don't care. You know, they might think, oh, like it saves us some hassle and we can cooperate a bit better in Europe. But, you know, most Europeans don't even get it, let alone people in America. And our job was to try and make it sexy. And they made me the person in charge of their main newsletter because they thought I understood the insides of the you know, like I understood where the treasure was inside the EU. And they weren't wrong. But again, I just didn't think there was any way I could sort of copy someone else in writing this newsletter that went out every single morning at 6 o'clock. You know, I would stay up until 2 a.m. working, go to sleep for 6 hours. The thing would come out while I was still asleep. It was this crazy experience. But it made me kind of like this sort of mayor of the town. Like I filled this position that didn't exist in the system. And again, that just came through of me just relying on my core personality rather than trying to pretend to be somebody else or live up to somebody else's expectation. And, you know, I find now in what I'm doing, it's not as successful as it was in Brussels because I had the right time, it was the right place. You know, sometimes there's luck and coincidence involved. But all the times I've succeeded, it's from being really directly true to myself.
Yeah, I think probably everyone listening in can really relate to that feeling where you don't want to rock the boat at work. You know, it's an uncomfortable conversations, but I feel like you're right. Sometimes we need to have those to move forward. And it may be a short-term, little uncomfortable, but long-term gain. Also, just quick little housekeeping thing. There is at the bottom of everyone's screen a Q&A option. If at any point during, I know we have Q&A at the end, but if at any point during any of these Q&A sections, like you have a quick one, please put it in there. I'm looking out for it so we can grab it and Ryan can ask something. So next question is, I know that you've interviewed a lot of pretty big figures, and you've had some, you've been through some interesting situations when it comes to reporting. And so I just wanted to hear and let some of the listeners hear too, your most interesting interview that you've had.
Can I cheat? Can I give you like a few answers?
Yes, you can cheat.
I'm terrible. Like, journalists are supposed to be really brief and succinct, and I'm terrible at stuff like this. So I always give long answers. So I think like the funnest thing, like just pure fun, was I interviewed Emmanuel Macron, and he's the president of France now. But I did an interview with him when he wasn't a nobody, but he didn't have a party. He was this total underdog person, like not even like a Bernie Sanders. I don't even know what the example would be. It'd be like Pete Buttigieg, running without a party to be the president of the US and then somehow starting to succeed. And so we arranged this big interview with him in Brussels, but I wanted to trap him. I'm still a journalist. Even though I think he's a good guy, I wasn't there to like be his cheerleader. And I knew that he was pretty sort of bougie. And so I came up with questions that would reveal his inner bouginess. And one of them was, when was the last time he built a piece of IKEA furniture? And I knew that he never would have done it, like without ever sort of having to check. I just knew it wouldn't be true. And he just froze, like he couldn't answer. And he's this sort of person, he flirts with everyone. He flirts with women, he flirts with men. He's like a total charmer. And he just sort of sat there frozen for about 10 seconds. And I was like, I got you. Like, you don't even have to answer now. Like, I know that you've never done this. So that felt good, because you rarely get those wins over these sort of very experienced politicians. But then like the weirdest one, and I'm going to actually have to curse here as well, because that's what happened in reality. I was interviewing the Pete Buttigieg of Belgium. So it's kind of a theme that we got going here. And he was like the infrastructure minister. And it was just such a really boring interview. And I was like, okay, we've got to get this over and done with. And I just did this layup question right at the end where I was like, okay, so what do you love most about Brussels? And you even felt bad asking it as a journalist because it's such a lame question. And the guy's like, well, you know what? Brussels is like a whore. She's really, really beautiful sometimes, and then she's just ugly and disgusting other times. And he just went on. And I was like, are you kidding me? And I just knew that this was going to cause problems for him. And he didn't even see it. Like, he's such a bad politician. He couldn't even see that was going to be a problem. And we put it out, like literally every single party campaigned that he had to make an apology. He was sort of not able to run for prime minister after that because it was such a scandal. And I felt a bit sorry for him in the end, because I think it was just like a stupid choice of words. But he definitely should not have walked into that. And then my serious answer to this question.
You didn't say a waffle. That could have been an easy answer.
Could have been easy. But I think, I don't know, like all politicians want to impress you. They want you to love them. And I try to be friendly, but not give away if I agree with them or not. Like I try to be a nice guy who's not for you or against you. And they want you to love them, so they keep just trying to make you love them more and more, and then they get into trouble sometimes. And then the serious answer was, I was interviewing the woman who was the Commissioner for Equality for the European Union, and it was right when all the Harvey Weinstein revelations came out. When he was revealed as having all these sexual assault situations. I think there were rape allegations as well. And her name's Vera Jourova. And I was interviewing her live on stage. That's in front of a big audience. It's obviously being live streamed as well. And she, in one of her answers, and it wasn't even about this, she said that she'd been a victim of sexual assault. And I had no idea it was going to happen. And she's a really tough cookie. Like, she grew up under communism in Czechoslovakia. She had even been jailed under false charges once from a political rival who wanted to get rid of her. So she's been through a lot, and she really opened up about how sometimes it's really hard to recognize that you're a victim of abuse. And even if you think you're a strong person and that this would never happen to someone like you, that she found herself in that situation. So I felt very privileged that she was willing to open up like that in an interview with me. And I just thought it was a very serious moment. And it was one of those times when I was like, okay, like just respect. I can't push you in any way on this. I just have to listen and hope that the audience sort of takes something away from it.
Would that kind of cover that? One of my questions was, you know, one of the most emotional or impactful interviews that you've done. Would that kind of cover that one?
No, I could go more. I don't know. It's like hard. I smile about things that are very serious, so I'm not trying to take things lightly. But I would definitely say the Brussels bombings were very emotional. So if you remember back to those stories at all, it was the day that Brussels got hit with 3 different bombs in 2016, and I've just never been so mad in my life. Like I knew people who were severely injured. My swimming coach is still in hospital 5 years later, actually. And she's just never going to walk again. And she's not well enough to get out of the hospital. And they gave her $25,000 in compensation. Like, it's just horrible stuff. And the Belgian authorities just failed us in every single way. And so it's not that an interview I did somehow revealed something special, but I just saw it as my mission to get on CNN round the clock. Like, I was just like, it could be like midnight, and I was standing there in in the freezing cold in a thick coat, going on explaining all of the things that were wrong with what the Belgians had done and what was inefficient about their system and so on. And I just felt that the world needed to know that. And I knew they would be really disorganized in presenting their own case. And I didn't think I could somehow sort of deliver justice for what had happened, but I could really put them on notice that they couldn't screw this up again. And so I just was like willing to talk to anyone about what I thought their failings were. And then another kind of pretty serious one, I kind of ran a campaign, and this is a tricky area for journalists, because it gets back to that question of like, is journalism fact-based? You know, how much of your own views can you inject into journalism? And this other story was about a guy who was campaigning to become the vice president of the European Union. And he gave a speech, and he thought it was a private audience, and he didn't realize that it was being taped. And so he just told a super racist joke about Chinese people. He made a joke about how women were better as housewives. And then he made another joke about gay marriage. And I wrote about it. I got the recording and I wrote about it. And I created the expectation that he would apologize. And he was just like, oh, no, you just don't understand my sense of humor. The problem is you for not having a sense of humor, sort of thing. And I was like, I'm not actually going to let this go. Like, it's like, I don't want my readers to be the butt of those sort of jokes. And I want to defend them. So I kind of chased him for a couple of days on it, and he would brush me off. And I was like, well, I can either let this go or I can get serious. And so I started a survey of all of his colleagues, like the other commissioners of the EU, the chiefs of staff, the spokespeople, and I gave them all a deadline of when they could reject his comments, or I would publish their names as agreeing with him. And I think it made my editors really angry. They thought I went too far. But about 6 hours before the deadline, he backed down, he apologized, and he withdrew his name from running for vice president. And I was like, well, good. Like, that needed to happen. And it didn't have to be that terrible. Like, I could have stopped that after one day, but I had to do it 6 days in a row to get him to do something. And I think that was very controversial in my newsroom, but I'm glad I did it.
We just had a question added to the Q&A. Someone wants to know, what's the best career advice that you've received?
Ooh, that's tricky. I think it's probably about my journalism, but it's specific to journalism. So I feel free to ask another one, because I feel like this is not a fair answer to you. And the point is that the sources are not your friends. Like, you are not there to be friends with the people who are giving you quotes. And that can be really tricky, because you obviously have to become familiar with people. You might be calling them in the middle of the night or interrupting their dinners and their family time and stuff like that. And you can't be mean to them, but they're not your friends. So at some point, you're going to hurt somebody in the work that you do. And you need to understand it when you do the job, and you need to be professional about it. But you need to accept that, you know, you're not there to protect the people you're writing about. And that can be really tricky, because it can make you feel like a mean person sometimes.
Hopefully that answered your question. If you've got a follow-up, I'm looking out.
Oh no, I've got another piece of advice. This is a general one. be nice to people because you just don't know when you're going to need them in the future. And the number of times where, and I don't follow it all the time, and I blow these people off because I think they're boring or I don't want to deal with them. And then 5 years later, they pop back up in some job where I wish I had been nicer to them, or I wish I still had their cell number and stuff like that. And, you know, I just think, you know, you can tell a lot by how well people treat service staff. And so you've always got to be nice in those situations because you don't know who those people are talking to and it's the right thing to do. And you never know when you're going to need someone else in the future. So you should just be nice to everyone in general is what I would say.
Not agree with you more. So I know this is probably weighing on a lot of people right now because it's a hot topic and it's real and timely. What is your feeling about the fake news era? And what do you believe the future of news looks like and media looks like and journalism looks like?
So many feelings. I could be here all night. I think in general, we need a clearer separation of opinion and news. I think that's a frustration a lot of people have, and I have it as well. Like I watched cable when it was the election drama and January 6th at the Capitol and so on. But most of the time, I just can't stand watching all of those people yelling at each other on cable. I think it doesn't bring a lot of clarity. And so I think it's a very strange time because at one hand, there is more good journalism than ever if you look for it and you know where to look for it. But people who do bad journalism or pretend to be journalists and they're not, they have a megaphone that can enable them to really spiral out of control and reach millions of people at no cost because they can shout for free wherever they want now. And that wasn't the case when you had 3 TV networks or you had to get into the good graces of the editor of your local paper to get your letter published or something like that. You know, I think there were too many restrictions in the past. And in some ways now there aren't enough restrictions. There's not enough quality filters out there. And that's partly the responsibility of journalists. Any profession needs to uphold its reputation and standards and enforce it on peers. Otherwise, you know, you can imagine if doctors did not uphold medical standards, they would suddenly have a pretty bad reputation. So I think we need to take some responsibility as journalists. At the same time, I think there was a big mistake by the people who ran media companies about 20 years ago, where they thought they could give away news for free and that internet advertising would somehow just make all this money for them. And we don't get anything else for free in life. Like we don't get coffee for free. We don't get taxis for free. We don't get houses for free. I don't know why we think suddenly journalism should exist for free and that, you know, journalists aren't going to have to get paid a salary somehow to do their jobs. So I think what that means is that, you know, in the same way that television got better when you started paying for it, you know, if you think about Netflix or HBO and so on, I think that subscription news is going to go back up again. And that's not a crazy idea. You know, you subscribe to magazines now. I just think we're going to see a lot more of that in terms of you'll find a newsletter you want to read, but you'll have to pay $5 a month for it. Maybe people aren't going to pay $500 a year for their local newspaper, but people are going to find bite-sized bits of news that they want, and they're going to find it in lots of different places, or they're going to get it in a podcast, and they're kind of going to assemble their own news feed. They're not going to do it on Facebook. You're going to have to spend a bit more time looking for it, a bit of money getting it, but you'll get something that's much more related to what you want if you make that effort.
Yeah, I think that's what's made it so difficult is, you know, I'm curious to know how many people in here tonight pay for some sort of news subscription. If y'all could drop that in the Q&A, I'm curious to know that. Just because I feel like a lot of people do kind of rely on what is free and accessible, going through your news feed or a free podcast. I'm just curious to know how many people actually pay for a subscription and what that is.
And where I think there might be a big breakthrough, and I've seen some sort of startups try this and I've never seen it really succeed. The thing I would love is if I could just have some system where it's linked to my PayPal or Venmo or whatever. And if I see an article, but it's behind the paywall, I would love to just pay 20 cents to read that article or whatever it is. Like I'm honestly not going to pay $30 to take out some subscription if it's like the Philadelphia Inquirer. But, you know, maybe I care about that article. I'd like to give you $1 for it or 25 cents for it. And there's got to be some system that allows us to do that. Otherwise, I think we probably are going to be stuck in these little silos, not talking to each other. And that is overall a very dangerous situation for the country.
Yeah, and I think it's also just remembering that there are, just like having you on here tonight, remembering there are, people that really have dedicated their lives to feeling as if they are sharing really important information that's as factual as possible, and they're doing their jobs, their careers. There's going to be people that, take advantage of that situation, as there are in every single industry, but there are real people behind it doing really good work.
Yeah, that's a really good point, where my mum does this to me even sometimes. My dad also, both of them, they're terrible. When they say, the media this, and I'm like, there's no, first of all, the media is your son. And you seem to love me in all these other ways. And why do you suddenly hate me when it comes to the media? But the media is all of these individuals. And like, in the same way that like not all men are the same, or not all baby boomers are the same, like the media is made up of all these different parts and all of these individuals. And it doesn't mean you can't dislike some of them, or, arrive at a negative conclusion. I'm not saying that we all do good things. But if I would urge you to do one thing, it's don't think of the media as one thing. There's a lot of journalists I disagree with as much as you do.
Yeah. And I think kind of continuing down this same path, I mean, all of us are, young professionals, and we are trying to do our best. Part of being in this organization is, being involved in our community, and we believe in making an impact. So in order to do that, we try to stay informed as much as we possibly can. So from your perspective, as young people who are searching for the truth, we want to make sure we're gathering factual information. How do we know who we can trust?
Yeah, I think the only real way to come up with a system that works for you is to come up with a mix of outlets that you would check on a regular basis. Or when something really jaw-dropping happens, go on Google and check to see who else is talking about that thing or what they're saying about it. Because if it's just one outlet, yes, maybe that journalist did a great job with an exclusive story, but sometimes things that sound too good to be true or too crazy to be true, they just are too crazy to be true. So don't share it until you've kind of checked it out a little bit more. But in terms of sort of a pick and mix sort of situation, I would choose maybe one sort of more right-wing, one more left-wing, and one more super neutral outlet that you keep in your bookmarks, or that you sort of make an effort to check out sort of on the TV, whatever it is that you prefer to use as the device for your news. Like the right and the left-wing ones are pretty obvious. Like, Fox is not a left-wing outlet. MSNBC is not a right-wing outlet. So I don't need to tell you that. In terms of the neutral ones, I think CBS is probably the most straight down the line network. It can be a bit boring sometimes, but you're just getting the neutral side of things. PBS is pretty good like that. Like, they have a really wide range of stuff that they cover. And a lot of something a lot of people don't know is Associated Press, which is this news agency that has people in every state and also in like dozens of countries around the world. You can get most of their stuff for free on their website. Maybe you get it 10 minutes later than the people who have a fancy subscription, but they do like super short stories, a bit like USA Today is another one I would put in that category. And if you really like politics, like Politico is the kind of down the middle one that I would recommend for you, because it goes very deep, but it doesn't try and take sides. But it is specific to politics. So if you are just more interested in wider stuff about the world or some other pet issue, Politico won't do the job for you. You'll need something else.
Someone wants to know specifically what your kind of go-to resources are. What's Ryan Heath reading in the morning?
Twitter is the first thing. And when I say reading Twitter, it's not like Twitter gives you something. It's like all the people you figure out how to follow on Twitter. And so I have a bunch of lists of people around different topics there as well. And so you can follow my lists if you want, if you go on my Twitter handle is @PoliticoRyan. And so you can see the people that I look at in the morning there and just join that list if you would like to do it. I do open New York Times quite a lot, just because they invest in so many places in the world. I don't necessarily agree with everything that they do, but they're going to be covering the right issues. So it's a good pointer about what is going to happen sort of in the rest of the day. And I think that is something to know as well about media in general, is that, most of the original reporting comes out of newspapers. And that can sound like self-interested because I'm kind of in that sort of section of the media. But a lot of what you see on television is people either working off the back of what the newspaper people found out, or reporting what people who work at newspapers have already reported. So the kind of like the seed of a lot of it comes out of newspapers. And television brings other things to it because a visual medium will tell you more about the character of a person or the ways they've reacted to some other thing. But often you can't be there with a camera to discover a critical piece of information. Like often you do have to be that newspaper person who has got 2 cell phones going and calling in the middle of the night and patching things together. And you can't really do that in live television. That's not kind of the nature of the medium. So if you want to be one of those people who's like in at like the very beginning of a piece of news information, like go to the written sources would be my recommendation.
Another one that we've got in the Q&A is, what podcasts do you listen to regularly?
I don't listen so much anymore, which is terrible. I've got one and I don't listen to that many. I really like Pivot by Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway. So he's a marketing professor and she was a tech journalist at the Wall Street Journal. And now she's kind of like her own media empire these days. I think she works with New York Magazine. They do this podcast. And so it's all about how do you change to cope with external threats? And it started off as a really tech-based podcast and now it does a bunch of other things. Who else? It's tricky. I kind of just dabble. I don't really listen to one that I go to on a super regular basis.
Can you talk about?
I hate the Daily. I cannot stand the Daily. The New York Times.
I love the Daily.
Oh, I mean, like people will hate my accent as well, but I just can't stand his voice. I can't deal with it.
It's soothing to me.
This is Michael Barbaro.
This is the Daily. There's always a nice pause in there. Can you talk a little? Tell them about yours though. When does it air?
Okay.
Shameless plug.
It's going to completely change. So you can listen to the previous one and it won't be anything like what is coming next. So with global translations, it's obviously trying to look at things that are changing the world. And so we've been looking at stuff that is not what you would see in normal headlines. So in this season, we did 12 episodes and we looked at things that are where there's a scarcity of them in the world. And so the first one we looked at is now actually coming into the regular mainstream news. We looked at critical minerals. So all the sorts of things that make smartphones work, electric vehicles, televisions, like all of these things that are just like difficult to mine minerals. You know, it's often a really bad mining process. It's very hard to mine them in the United States and meet environmental standards. So China's got a huge chunk of the market. Like 80% of all of these minerals come from China now, and they have terrible standards. And a lot of the other ones come from really exploited places in Africa. And it's just a very nasty, messy situation. And so the US hasn't really looked out for its national security in allowing that to happen. And by kind of saying, oh, we don't want these environmental mining, we don't want these mining processes in the US, it hasn't stopped them. It just meant that they're happening in a country where this stuff is not being monitored properly. So not just Americans, but Europeans, Australians as well, have exported these environmental problems and kind of dumped them into China. And it means China now has this terrible grip on all of these strategic devices and industries that we all rely on for our economy to function or for our defense systems to function. And so it's going to become a really messy situation. And so we looked into that for 3 episodes. We looked into skills shortages, like people not having the right skills to do the jobs that the digital economy needs, and how the US has a really strange system for this, where it relies on a lot of local and private initiative, and there are no national standards for this. There's really not a lot of national funding, and it's very different to other countries like in Asia and in Europe. And so we talked to people about how that might change, or could it really change, or is the American system capable of reforming itself and doing better? So it's kind of not the normal topics that you would be hearing on a podcast, but I think you walk away going, oh, okay, I didn't know that. I feel smarter now. That's my goal when I do the podcast. And then when we come back for the next season, we're going to be much more driven by the news, and we're going to have people, I'm going to have a person in Europe, a person in Asia, a person in Australia, and we're all going to talk about what we think about this given issue that's happened and how our countries are reacting to it and where's the common ground and where's the differences and stuff like that.
Which it's called Global Translations. And I think it is interesting because so much has been happening in a very quick time frame with US politics, but there's a lot going on in the globe. So we could stay up to date with you on that. So we have a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to
be quick with my answers now. I'm going to stop these long ass answers.
We've got 15 minutes. So I want to try to get through some of these. So the first one is, I commend your gumption and courage in publishing your swear word titled resolution for its content. Representative Eric Swalwell said it best during the Democratic primary debate that Biden and folks his age need to pass the torch to us younger generations, although I think we could use a few years. Any suggestions on how young radicals can fight the man while achieving actual lasting progress in important areas like climate and the economy?
Yeah, I think my top advice is focus on those issues that are really going to make a change. And so you already mentioned climate. I think Stacey Abrams is on the money with increasing access to voting and making sure that's an open system. And I know the Republicans came from a very different standpoint in Georgia, but also the way your elections were conducted in the face of all that pressure from Trump, I think just shows that everyone is a winner when there are more people voting and more people are participating. And I think the line that I've always tried to toe is to be what I call an insider-outsider, where I want to be relevant to the insiders. I've gone up the mountain in Davos to meet with the grossest, richest, corruptest people. And not everyone there is like that. There's a lot of well-meaning people who are actually doing good things. But I've really thrown myself in the mix with some nasty people as well. And I want them to see that what I'm doing is relevant. At the same time, I don't want to be like them. I don't want to be the person who just takes the champagne because the champagne's there and it feels good. And, oh, look, we all got to go on a military helicopter to this place. And now I'm going to write the story you want. So I think it's important that you sort of have a clear sense of your own values, be willing to stand for them. And I think young people today are doing a really good job at that. I think previous generations felt like they couldn't change in the way that society needed to change. And they made a lot of compromises. And I even look back on people like President Obama, and he seemed like such a revolutionary figure at the time when he came in. And then you look at what happened, and there was a lot of compromising going on. And I think it's good when people are willing to stand more clearly for what they want. But at the end of the day, politics is also about getting things done. So whatever it is that you're standing for, don't be left on the outside just shouting. You've got to do more than shout, whatever it is that you care for. You've got to find a way to concretely change things. And I hope I can tell those stories, and I have confidence you can do it.
So another question, how did you end up at Politico, and who first got you interested in journalism?
Yeah, it's so funny. I was in this sort of, I guess you'd call it a public speaking competition when I was 16. And one of the questions they asked was what are you going to do in 10 years time? I was like, I'm going to be the youngest ever editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. So I was always interested in journalism. I always wanted to tell stories. I wanted to see my name in the paper. I just wanted to be part of the action. It was all about feeling like you were part of the action. That's what made me interested in news in the first place. And Politico was just a total coincidence. I had done all of this time inside the EU. I thought I was going to go outside and set up this speech writing business. And I imagined that I would somehow consult to all of these politicians that I believed in around the world or whatever. And it just went nowhere. No one wanted to hire me at all. And luckily, Politico turned up in town just as I was trying to start that business. And they also couldn't find the person they needed to write this playbook newsletter that I ended up writing for them. So I was their third choice for this newsletter. And it was just because these other people were afraid they weren't going to get good vacation, basically, with Politico, this American company. So I was super lucky. And yeah, but I just turned up, and I didn't try and sugarcoat myself in that interview. And I was lucky. I kind of went on a rant about Vladimir Putin, and maybe the guy on the other side of the table liked Putin. I don't know, but I went on my rant, and that meshed with his thinking about the world, and I got the job.
As a foreigner covering U.S. politics, what strengths do you feel like that gives you? And what is something essentially American that simply can't be explained?
Oh, that's a good one. I'll start with I think as an outsider, as an Australian in particular, it might be different if I came with a completely different accent or I looked different in some way, but I think people treat me as like a friendly ally. Like they don't believe I could be doing anything bad to them. So they just talk to me in a way they might be suspicious of an American who turned up in that same situation. So I like that. And because I don't really have the same skin in the game, obviously I care and I pay attention. I probably would not have voted for Donald Trump if I had a vote. But they say he's also a very particular person. So I don't want to make that a blanket statement. I can see things a little bit more clearly, maybe. I don't bring the same assumptions other people would bring to the table. I can kind of walk into a situation or a room and be like, well, why do you do that? That doesn't make any sense. Like, what do you mean you don't have a national standard for this? Like, that's crazy. Why would you have 3,000 counties all do the election in their own special way? And that's what Americans do differently. You all, I'm not saying you have to have every ballot paper looking the same in every state, but your election system is crazy, capital C crazy. To do it in 3,000 different ways oh my God, I just can't believe it. It's just unbelievable. And in some ways it makes American democracy really resilient. And that's what we've seen over all of these past weeks and months. People are so passionate here, and you all talk at Thanksgiving and at Christmas about politics, and maybe that gets too much sometimes, but in Australia, where I come from, I'm this asshole who ruins dinner if I talk about politics. People just want to go to the beach and they want to have fun and they want to talk about the steak they're going to cook or the coffee they're going to buy. They do not want to talk about all of these more complicated things. And so I love being in America where people do want to talk about it. We probably took it one step too far in recent years, but all of the things that will make America right are here within you all now. You don't need to worry about that. You're going to fix this place.
Needed to hear that. Thank you. Someone else wants to hear your thoughts on the future of Facebook, Twitter, and social media in the UK since English football's letter plus demands of Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg.
I don't know exactly what the Premier League has done recently, but what I will tell you is that there is a tidal wave of complaints and legal action against the big tech companies now, and it's coming from the strangest places and strangest quarters. European countries implementing taxes. Okay, we could probably predict that. That's not completely crazy. But just today in Australia, Google has come to a big agreement with Rupert Murdoch, as in the guy who owns Fox News, and he owns 70% of the newspapers in Australia. He's born there and grew up there. And now Google will pay Rupert Murdoch for his newspaper's content to appear on Google, rather than it just appearing for free in the search engine. And Facebook and Google had huge fights with the Australian government about that. And it's like a Republican government in Australia. These are not progressive people at all. And they just felt that Australian media were being completely ripped off by the big tech companies. And so they started a big fight with them, and they're basically winning. Google's doing these deals before the law even got passed, and the law will get passed next week. In North Dakota, they're trying to do similar things to break the link between the iPhone and the App Store, so that in the same way as if you had a MacBook and you can download apps from a website or wherever the hell you want and put them on your MacBook, the people who published this bill in North Dakota want to be able to do that on the iPhone or on your Android phone, and you can already do that on Android, I think. And we're just seeing these attacks happening in all these different places. And maybe attacks is too negative. Maybe we could just call it accountability, because I think these big tech companies have had a lot of freedom to do a lot of things for a long time. And because they are usually the smartest, richest people in the room, they often outwit regulators. And people who are making laws often move slower than the innovation process moves. So they can look sort of a bit bumbling and stupid compared to these innovative companies. But we have also seen so many effects that we were not expecting from these companies sort of taking over our public debate and our public life. And I think, it is time for rebalancing. It's not my job to put my thumb on the scale for any one particular idea, but, a company like Twitter, he's got a part-time CEO and it's kind of running half of our news debate. Like, that is not a way to conduct a democracy. Like, there's got to be other ways to do it. And Facebook, you know, like they'll sit there and tell you that they never do anything wrong, and that, oh, they try their hardest. And it's like, it's not good enough anymore. You know, like, when the things you do lead to violence or a genocide in Myanmar, like, you have to do better. You have to have more checks and balances. You have to spend more money. And if you have to lose some money to get things right, we'll lose some money. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that reckoning over the next year or two.
So 2 more questions I have. We've got a couple minutes left. So anybody else that has questions, drop them in there. We'll try to get through them. So someone said, I was reading about the developments about the Caliphate podcast from New York Times. As a journalist who has also developed and hosted a podcast series, how do journalists navigate this new world? Yeah,
that can be really tricky. So I think that's a very scary world for me, because I don't know a lot about Middle Eastern politics, and I can imagine that is scary for everyone involved in the process.
Can you give a little background for those who may not know what that question is?
Yeah, so it was an ISIS themed podcast from the New York Times, and it turns out that some of the stuff that was put into the podcast was not properly verified information. And because it's the New York Times, then there's a big problem when that happens. But it's not the first time this has happened at the New York Times. And this is pure speculation. It's not me commenting as a Politico employee, but I think the New York Times has such a global reputation that I think there is a lot of pressure, if you're there, to keep living up to a certain standard. And there's a lot of glamour associated with it. So that if you can meet that standard, even if you take a little shortcut sometimes, the payoff can be really big for you. And I think that sometimes creates this toxic dynamic, and explains a little bit why New York Times keeps ending up in this situation. At the same time, they have like 800 reporters. So if one reporter every 5 years does this, like, there are bad eggs everywhere. Like, I don't think it means like the New York Times is evil. I certainly wouldn't say that. But what I would say is that, one of the reasons why I'm so skeptical of the Daily is that, they've got like 50 people working on it. If you gave me 49 people to help me with my podcast, it'd be great. Like, we'd all be talking somewhere else, and I'd be buying you champagne somewhere, because the podcast would be hugely successful. So when an organization has as many resources as the New York Times, like, everyone has an obligation to get it right, but like, they really, when they mess up, it means they really mess up, because they should have done better, basically. For my own podcast, we have fact checkers. So, and this is an important thing to know about everything that we do at Politico, and it's true in most good newspapers as well, is I don't just write something and then it gets published. Like, that is not how it works. So it goes through 2 editors. Like, nothing that you can read from me at Politico can appear on that screen until 2 people have gone through it and checked that I didn't make 50 typos, and I'm always making typos. They ask me questions about who the sources were and how do I know them. They want to see links to back up different claims or statistics that I'm using. It will get passed on to someone who's got nothing to do with me and my global news area, and they will ask, all the dumb questions that my first editor couldn't have noticed, because he's like deep in the weeds of what I'm doing. And we have that with our podcast as well. And we end up having to retrack things, where we re-record stuff sort of at least a couple of times to make sure that it's sort of good quality in all respects. So none of this stuff happens quickly on a podcast, unless it is a daily thing and you're like going right off the news sort of thing. So, if you mess up big time on a podcast, like, the mess was a slow train wreck that was building over time, and multiple people were probably involved in the problem, is what I would say.
So I feel like this is a good one to kind of end on, unless anyone else pops in for a last question.
Mm-hmm.
What is the number one global issue that we should be, I don't want to say worried about, but maybe that we're unaware of, that we need to know, we need to pay attention to right now?
Ooh, that's tricky. I think probably, I'm not saying that people are unaware of it, so I wouldn't say that, but climate is one of those ones where this is the year of reckoning on climate, where the Paris Agreement that Biden has just rejoined is kind of, it's important, but it's out of date now. Like, things have changed. Things are getting out of control with what's happening with the climate. And there must be an updated global agreement, and the US can't do it on its own. But the US has to be a central part of all of that. And it's going to cost money. And I really think that, we can debate what is the most efficient way to deal with this, and there are lots of different ways and lots of different opinions on that. But we've got to get past this idea that sort of climate change is an opinion, or that it's not going to cost some money. It's definitely going to cost some money. And we need to think about how much we're going to save by dealing with it now versus the cost of waiting and waiting and waiting. So I would just urge people to keep an eye on that, and to really listen in on the different debates in Congress, because Biden can't do any of that on his own. He can make promises, but he will have to have money from Congress and approval from Congress for it to succeed. And that's a real knife-edge situation.
Okay, so we had one more, and then we can wrap it up. Someone wants to know your thoughts on the recent sale of the Chicago Tribune newspaper to Alden and the Baltimore Sun's new nonprofit status. As a local journalist working at different corporate-owned newspaper chain, what are your thoughts on the impact these consolidations and sales have on journalism?
I've got a cold 4-year-old who's come into the room. His mummy's going to catch him right now. Hang on one second. I'll come in a minute, Archie. It's okay. We're going to get warm very soon. He's been out in the snow in a hot tub, so it's a very strange situation for a 4-year-old. So,
question.
I can read the question from Nick. Yeah, okay. I didn't quite hear exactly what you said, Katie, but I can read the question. So I think I'm really attracted to this idea of non-profit status for newspapers, because I think it's going to be very hard for some newspapers to turn a profit. And I think we should just be really open to all the different ways that we could have quality news in our communities. And so that might lead us back to things like universities running newspapers. It might lead to rich benefactors sort of giving a gift when they die to help keep a newspaper running sort of on an ongoing basis. That's one of Britain's most famous newspapers, runs on the basis of a trust that someone set up when they died about 150 years ago. And it's really successful today. I think that we have seen some newspapers, and I think the Chicago Tribune fits into this, but some of them have been bought out by private equity people, thinking that they can, show these journalists how to run a real business sort of thing. And every time I've seen someone try and do that, it's people who don't really understand the complexity of news and the way the most interesting stuff is the most expensive to create. And some of the bets don't come off. And yes, you're going to end up having some people on staff that maybe aren't the most efficient, or they've been there too long, or they're on an old union contract that costs too much for some reason or whatever. But the thing is, it's an ecosystem. And like with any ecosystem, if you just kind of try and blow it up and think that you can put in some concrete parking lot and, just replace the ecosystem with that, and it looks new and efficient, there are things you don't understand that you're wrecking when you wreck it. And I think we've done enough of that wrecking over the last 20 years. So we should focus on, okay, what are some new ways to just keep the patient alive rather than keep trying to blow things up and renovate it. We know that people basically want facts. We know they want it told to them in an accessible, not overly dramatic way. And we just need to find lots of different ways to fund it and be willing to experiment with it, I would think.
Awesome. Great questions. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in tonight and listening to Ryan. Ryan, thank you for joining us. And if anybody else has any other questions, I'm sure if you get my email address and email them to me, Ryan will be happy to answer.
100%, and throw them at me online. And I come down to Columbus 2 or 3 times a year. So you will find me drinking the best coffee in town, or the poke bowl down at that new food court down near the river. That's where I'll be.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Everybody have a good night, and we will see everyone soon.